The winter wind made a knife out of the high desert. A wagon creaked across ruts near the Owyhee River, canvas tight as a drumhead, oxen blowing steam in the moonlight. A guard rode the flank with a rifle across the saddle. A shot cracked from the rocks, and the canyon threw it back again and again. The driver snapped the reins. A lantern slipped from a hook and burst on the ground. Sparks skittered over frost and went dark. By dawn, the station tallied what was missing: a dead ox in the traces, a torn canvas panel, and 2 empty places at the fire. People later called it the Snake War, a name settlers used for many bands who never used it themselves: Northern Paiute, Bannock, and Shoshone families who moved with the weather, fish runs, and the cycle of roots. The Civil War raged far to the east, but out here, the fighting was smaller and constant, driven by hunger, trespass, and fear. Freight roads and mining camps crossed ground where people had set their lives to the seasons. Springs that had watered rabbit drives now filled barrels for stage teams. Seed meadows that fed horses for winter hunts were fenced for cattle. Gold poured into the Boise Basin and the Owyhee Canyonlands, and stations rose like islands of new lumber in seas of sage. A quarrel over forage became a raid on cattle. A raid brought a reprisal at a winter camp. A reprisal set off another killing 100 miles away. Each settlement told the story in its own voice, and each version carried fresh grief. Northern Paiute families who followed circuits of roots and rabbit nets watched freight roads chew up gathering grounds. Shoshone and Bannock riders saw herds spread across valleys they counted on for grass and water. In town, men slept with boots by the door and rifles within reach. The reports read like a map that would not sit still. Camp Lyon on the Owyhee, Fort Boise on the Snake, Camp Warner near the Alkali Lakes. Soldiers rode in loops as the seasons changed, too slow in summer heat, cut off by winter storms, always a day behind. Bands split and rejoined in rim rock and lava, struck a herd at dawn, and vanished into a dry wash by noon. When a patrol finally caught up, it stumbled over a line between families and fighters that never held. A burned station meant the next train carried an extra guard. The next dawn brought soldiers to a willow bottom where women warmed roots over a small fire. By 1864, the country moved to a rhythm. Wagons traveled under escort. Stage lines shortened their runs. Ranchers kept saddles by the door. In Harney Valley and up toward the Crooked River, the Northern Paiute leader Paulina led fast raids that were gone before a company could saddle. Down along the Humboldt and across southern Idaho, Shoshone and Bannock bands struck where food traveled: beef on the hoof, sacks of flour, strings of horses. For each station that burned came a raid on a winter camp. For each raid came a chase across Black Rock, where a wounded man froze before he bled out. In 1866, a new field commander took charge, a wiry officer named George Crook, who traveled light and moved when others waited for spring. He split his men into small parties and hired native scouts who knew where canyons pinch and where water lies under ice. That winter, he turned the Owyhee into a web of campfires. Columns struck at daybreak from different directions. Men carried just enough to go 2 days and met pack trains in the dark. Camps found at sunrise were empty by noon, fires buried, trails brushed with sage to hide the start of another march. Promises were fragile. Agents talked of treaties and boundaries drawn by surveyors who had never ridden a rabbit drive. Rations were pledged to families told to settle near posts, and sometimes the flour spoiled on the way, or the wagons never came. People left the agencies to gather food and were hunted as raiders. At Fort Harney, the Army and the Indian Office pulled in different directions, one speaking of disarming the country, the other promising tools and teachers. Neither sounded like safety to a mother with children and a thin stack of dry roots. The war did not belong to one famous day. It was a road of days. Late in 1866, Crook struck a Paiute camp near the Owyhee in a freezing storm and scattered it across snow-bright flats. Early in 1867, another column hit along Jordan Creek and brought in prisoners who counted their families aloud so the officers would write the numbers down. That April, near the Crooked River, an Oregon rancher named Howard Maupin and his party ambushed Paulina. Word of it broke spirits more efficiently than any patrol. Some called it justice. Others called it the killing of a man fighting for the only life he knew. By 1868, fatigue did what bullets had not. Horses were worn thin. Ammunition was short on both sides. Families who had spent winters hiding along the rim of Steens Mountain and summers dodging columns across the Malheur Flats began to surrender at Fort Harney and other posts simply to live. Leaders gave their names and counted their people. Agents counted sacks of flour and promised new beginnings on lands set aside on paper. New settlers, believing the road was open, pushed herds onto meadows that had fed root diggers for generations. Every handshake carried the fear that the next wagon would tilt everything back into violence. Counting the dead is never neat, but even cautious tallies say the Snake War took more lives than many better-known frontier fights. Soldiers and settlers fell by the dozens, native men, women, and children by the hundreds. Disease walked with columns and into camps where the last roots boiled in thin broth. Numbers cannot show what was lost when winter stores burned, when a hunter who knew the hidden springs lay dead, when a child who had learned each plant by touch was told to wait behind a fence. Stand there today in late fall, and the wind still rolls over flats of gray brush and a long black rock that holds the day's heat. Wagon tracks are gone, but old station sites leave squares of nails and glass. Markers for soldiers rise on some hills. Far fewer markers speak for the families who camped in willow bottoms and moved with storms. Rivers that once ran brown with melt now turn turbines. Roads follow trails that shifted with the seasons, and cattle graze places where obsidian still glints in dust. After the worst winter marches, posts such as Harney and Warner held the Army's reach, and agencies steered families toward reservations at Warm Springs and later Malheur. Some tried to rebuild near agency fields and schoolhouses. Others slipped away to hunt, because staying felt like surrender. Traders came with wagons of calico and coffee. Surveyors set section lines across meadows that had never been fenced. It was a hard peace, negotiated day by day, and it never felt even to those who had given up the most. The Snake War ended without a parade. It left posts that became towns and others that sank back into grass. It left reservations born from compromise and crisis. It left stories carried in two languages, sometimes inside the same family. For some, it proved the road was open. For others, it proved a road could be forced through a life already set by the land. And when people argue now over water, range, and right-of-way, they argue inside the long shadow of those years. On certain evenings in Harney County, the sky clears to a hard blue, and the light lays long across the basin. From a distance, the land looks empty and calm. Up close, the wind catches at the grass, and the rocks seem to remember footsteps. You can imagine a column climbing into the hills, and a small camp going still as that sound fades. Between them is where most of the fighting happened, out of sight of any flag, between hunger and fear, carried by people trying to keep their families through another winter. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.